EU chief Ursula von der Leyen says the EU is preparing for further countermeasures against US tariffs.
U.S. President Donald Trump has declared a 10% baseline tax on imports from all countries and even higher tariff rates on dozens of nations.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the United States expects its NATO partners to start prioritizing defense. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the EU is preparing for further countermeasures against the 20% tariff on European goods announced by US President Donald Trump.
We are prepared to respond. We are already finalizing the first package of countermeasures in response to tariffs on steel. And we are now preparing for further countermeasures to protect our interests and our businesses if negotiations fail.
On Wednesday, the US president announced a minimum 10% tariff on all countries, with the EU added to a list of 60 worst offenders, facing a higher tailored rate of 20%. He also announced a 25% tariff on all automobiles made outside the US to be implemented with immediate effect. Sweden and Ireland have already issued statements saying they regret the additional tariffs, which will come into force next Wednesday. However, Irish Deputy Leader Simon Harris urged the bloc to remain calm and measured in its response.
The statement this morning by European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen clearly sought to reassure Europeans that the EU is ready to protect itself from Washington's decision to impose tariffs. Speaking from Samarkand, Uzbekistan, where she will later attend the first ever EU Central Asia Summit, von der Leyen said Europe has everything it needs to make it through the storm and is now preparing further measures. But she nonetheless made it clear that Europe wants a negotiated solution because it stands for fair and rules-based trade, which will be one of the main message in her talks with Central Asian leaders today and tomorrow. Alice Tidy in Samarkand for Euronews.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day.
U.S. President Donald Trump has declared a 10% baseline tax on imports from all countries and higher tariff rates on dozens of nations that run trade surpluses with the United States. Imports on goods from the European Union are facing a 20% tax, Trump announced as he held up a chart at the White House.
European Union, they're very tough, very, very tough traders. You think of European Union, very friendly. They rip us off. It's so sad to see. It's so pathetic. 39%, we're going to charge them 20%, so we're charging them essentially half.
Trump promised Americans that factory jobs will return back to the United States, but his policies risk a sudden economic slowdown as consumers and businesses could face sharp price hikes.
For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. American steelworkers, auto workers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen, we have a lot of them here with us today. They really suffered gravely. They watched in anguish as foreign leaders have stolen our jobs, foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories, and foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful American dream.
Trump's announcement threatens to upend much of the architecture of the global economy and trigger broader trade wars. Longtime trade partners, including the EU, have already hit back at previously announced tariffs on steel and aluminium.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the United States has prioritized defense and now expects its partners to do the same.
Say hello.
Rubio spoke ahead of a joint meeting of NATO foreign ministers, having arrived in Brussels just a day after Trump announced sweeping global tariffs on exports to the U.S.
And so we do want to leave here with an understanding that we are on a pathway, a realistic pathway, to every single one of the members committing and fulfilling a promise to reach up to 5% of spending.
Trump's presidency has marked a shift in global relations, with European allies increasingly concerned by his readiness to improve US ties with Russia, which sees NATO as a threat. This unease has been deepened by recent White House insults directed at NATO allies Canada and Denmark, along with a warning from US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth that US security priorities lie elsewhere, namely in Asia and on the US's own border. As a result, European governments are developing plans to assume more responsibility for their own security, with hopes of preventing a vacuum if US troops and equipment are withdrawn. Rubio stated, however, that Trump is not against NATO, but he is against a NATO that does not have the capabilities it needs to fulfill its obligations. World leaders have been reacting to US President Donald Trump's announcement of a 10% baseline tariff on all countries, with Australia threatening to use dispute resolution powers in its free trade agreement with the United States.
We will continue to make the strongest case for these unjustified tariffs to be removed from our exporters. Our existing free trade agreement with the United States contains dispute resolution mechanisms.
China, which was hit with an extra 34% tariff, has said it will resolutely adopt countermeasures to safeguard its rights and interests, claiming Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs violate international trade rules and amount to unilateral bullying. Japan, too, has called the tariffs extremely regrettable, with officials arguing Japan deserves an exemption considering the additional 24% levies already imposed on their country. And in South Korea, which was hit with a 25% rate, the stock market opened lower amid concerns over the tariff announcement. Although Canada and Mexico were exempt from this particular round, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said Ottawa will respond, as the current 25% levies on steel and aluminium imposed on both nations remain in place. At least 7 people have died after a boat carrying migrants from Turkey to the Greek island of Lesbos capsized, according to Greece's Coast Guard. The bodies, which included 2 children, were recovered as part of a search and rescue operation. 23 other people were rescued and taken to a nearby hospital. The operation is ongoing, with 3 Coast Guard vessels, an Air Force helicopter and a nearby boat, all combing the area for any further potential victims.
Israel's military operation in the Gaza Strip is expanding to seize large areas, the defense minister announced. Israel Katz said the offensive would expand to, in his words, crush and clean the area of militants and seize large areas that will be added to the security zones of the State of Israel. While he didn't specify which parts of Gaza would be seized, Katz announced an extensive evacuation of Palestinians from fighting areas. Israel has long maintained a buffer zone inside Gaza along its security fence. This has greatly expanded since the war began in 2023. Israel says the buffer zone is needed for security, while Palestinians view it as a land grab. Katz's announcement came as Israel continued targeting the Gaza Strip with overnight strikes, reportedly killing at least 30 people.
At least 4 people have died following a Russian missile attack on the Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih. The head of the city's military administration said a large fire broke out and several apartment buildings were damaged. 14 people were injured in the strike, according to the regional governor, including an 8-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl. Kryvyi Rih is the hometown of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and lies around 70 kilometers from the nearest front line.
Europe has around 2,000 combat aircraft. While European models like the French Rafale, the Swedish Gripen and the European Typhoon consortium make up the bulk of the continent's air force, the F-35 from America's Lockheed Martin is a must-have. Italy has ordered 90 of this aircraft, Germany 35, Belgium 34 and Poland 32. All in all, Europe will be able to rely on a further 200 American aircraft in the coming years. This comes at the risk of maintaining its military dependence on the US despite EU calls for strategic autonomy.
Il y a une forme de dépendance parce que c'est un appareil qui est très sophistiqué et qui nécessite beaucoup de maintenance. Ça signifie qu'il faut remplacer des pièces régulièrement. La chaîne logistique qui produit ces pièces, eh bien, elle est gérée par Lockheed Martin aux États-Unis. Et donc à ce niveau-là, on peut dire qu'il y a une forme de dépendance des États-Unis.
When it comes to Air Force, American technology has an advantage over European aircraft.
Il y a quand même une petite différence parce que les Américains maîtrisent malgré tout des technologies, notamment en termes de furtivité, que ne maîtrisent pas aujourd'hui les Européens. La question est évidemment de savoir est-ce que pour les opérations de combat modernes, la furtivité est quelque chose d'absolument requis ou bien est-ce que l'on peut s'en passer et compter sur des avions qui sont capables de présenter un haut niveau de discrétion.
Questions are also being raised concerning Washington's ability to ground aircraft through the possibility of using special software. However, using this kill switch could deal a blow to American reliability and the lucrative exports of its military industry.